The blizzard does not howl, it screams. It is a raw, serrated sound that scours the mountainside, stripping pine needles from branches and hope from the souls of men. Three figures, more ghost than human, push through the blinding white. They are a single, stumbling organism of desperation, bound by the shared certainty of a frozen death. Caleb, the eldest, breaks the trail, his beard a solid mask of ice. Behind him, Silas, gaunt and silent, leans into the wind as if it were a physical blow. Finn, the youngest, with the fire of youth long since banked to a dull ember, brings up the rear, his curses swallowed by the gale. For 2 days, they have eaten nothing but handfuls of snow. Their prospecting dreams, once bright as a summer stream, are now just another frozen memory buried under the relentless storm. Then, a miracle. A flicker of gold through the maelstrom, too steady for a lantern, too warm for a star. A window. A house. It is a bastion against the screaming white, a promise of life huddled against the indifferent rock. They claw their way towards it, falling, rising, driven by the final, primal instinct to survive. The house is large, formidable, built of thick-hewn logs and stone, with a plume of smoke rising defiantly from its chimney. It speaks of wealth and solitude. Caleb pounds a frozen fist against the solid oak door, the sound a dull thud against the storm's symphony. He pounds again. Bolts scrape from within, loud and decisive. The door cracks open, spilling a rectangle of impossible warmth and light onto the snow. A woman stands there, silhouetted. She is large, her frame filling the doorway, a double-barreled shotgun held steady in her hands, its twin muzzles looking like two dark eyes staring straight into their souls. Well, that's one way to meet. Before these two figure each other out, tell us, what's the most unexpected way you've ever met someone important? Share your story in the comments. And if you love a surprising romance, hit that like button. She is not young, her face a roadmap of hard-won years, her eyes sharp and assessing. She is, Caleb registers with the detached clarity of the near-dead, Obese, a woman of significant substance in a world that prized scarcity. He sees the shotgun, the unyielding set of her jaw, and knows that pity is a currency she does not trade in. Desperation makes a man shed his pride like a worn-out coat. It forces words from a frozen throat that would shame him in a warmer world. Finn collapses into the snow behind him, a final, guttural moan escaping his lips. It is the sound of the end. Caleb looks from his fallen companion to the woman in the door, and with the last of his strength, he makes the only offer he has left. He sinks to his knees, his voice a raw croak. "Please, ma'am," he begs, the words tearing at his throat. "Let us stay. Let us stay, and we will have sex with you for a moment." His desperate plea hangs in the frozen air, a shocking, crude monument to their absolute ruin. The woman's expression does not change. She simply raises the shotgun a fraction of an inch, the gesture a final, damning answer. And with that small movement, his world, and theirs, seemed destined to end right there on her doorstep. The silence that followed Caleb's desperate plea was heavier than the snow-laden pines surrounding them. The wind paused its assault, as if to listen. Agnes Blackwood had been called many things in her 50 years: fat, rich, reclusive, stubborn. The widow of a man who had prized her father's land more than her company, she had inherited his fortune and his isolation in equal measure. But no one had ever made her such an offer. It was vulgar, pathetic, and raw with a truth she understood better than most: the things people will do when they have nothing left to lose. She looked down at the three of them. The one on his knees, Caleb, had eyes that held the last flicker of a leader's fire, now banked with shame. The one swaying on his feet, Silas, was a specter, his gaze distant, as if he were already looking into the next world. And the boy in the snow, Finn, was a heap of rags and bone, barely breathing. She had spent a decade alone on this mountain, fending off condescending bankers from the town of Redemption below, their offers to manage her estate a thinly veiled attempt to steal it. She knew the language of transactional desperation. Her shotgun remained level. "Get him inside," she ordered, her voice a low rumble that carried easily over the wind's renewed whine. She gestured with the barrel toward Finn. "The other two of you can follow. Try anything, and the only warmth you'll feel is from the blast of this gun." Caleb and Silas didn't need to be told twice. They hoisted Finn's dead weight, their movements clumsy with exhaustion, and stumbled over her threshold. The heat of the cabin was a physical shock, a thick, living presence that smelled of pine wood, stew, and beeswax. Agnes kicked the door shut, the sound echoing with finality. The main room was vast, dominated by a stone fireplace where a whole log was blazing. Polished wood floors were covered with thick bear and wolf pelts. A long dining table stood ready, and shelves overflowed with books. It was a fortress of comfort and solitude. "Put him by the fire," she commanded, never lowering the shotgun. "Strip off his wet things. All of you." There was no modesty left in them. They peeled away the frozen layers of canvas and wool, their skin underneath a mottled, unhealthy blue. They were shockingly thin, their ribs like a cage of bent twigs. Agnes watched them with an unreadable expression. She saw not men, but livestock brought in from a storm, and there was a flicker of something in her, not pity, but a grim sense of stewardship. This was her land. These were her mountains. The storm had washed these creatures up on her shore. She disappeared into a pantry and returned with 3 coarse blankets, which she threw on the floor. "Wrap yourselves. There's stew on the stove. You'll eat in shifts. One at a time, at the table. The other 2 will stay on the floor where I can see you." Caleb was the first to eat. He sat at the magnificent table, a steaming bowl of venison stew before him, the thick blanket clutched around his shoulders. He felt like a beggar at a king's feast. He ate slowly, deliberately, forcing himself not to gorge like an animal. He could feel her eyes on him from her armchair by the fire, the shotgun resting across her wide lap. The town of Redemption, nestled in the valley, was a place they'd only passed through for supplies. He remembered the whispers, the stares directed at a large woman who drove her own wagon and bought supplies with crisp Citibank notes. The Blackwood widow, they said it like a curse or a ghost story. Now, that ghost was his keeper. He had offered her the last shred of his dignity, and she had ignored it, offering him soup instead. He didn't know which was worse. The days that followed fell into a rigid, unspoken routine. The storm raged for another 48 hours, trapping them inside the warm, silent prison of the cabin. Agnes Blackwood was a creature of habit and fierce self-sufficiency. She rose before dawn, her movements surprisingly quiet for a woman of her size, tending the fire, checking her pantry, oiling her collection of rifles with practiced efficiency. She spoke only to give orders. "There's wood to be split in the lean-to. The pump handle needs a new leather washer. Check the livestock in the barn. See if that new calf is still breathing." The men worked. As their strength returned, fueled by plain, plentiful food, they threw themselves into the labor. It was a way to repay their debt, but more than that, it was a way to avoid looking her in the eye. Caleb's crude offer hung in the air between them, a ghost of their shame. He and his companions never spoke of it, but it was there in their averted gazes, in the way they flinched slightly when she entered a room. They discovered the rhythm of her life. She was utterly alone, but not lonely. Her world was the ranch, a sprawling, prosperous operation inherited from her late husband, Jedediah. From the state of the fences and the health of the cattle, it was clear she managed it with a shrewdness that belied the town's dismissive whispers. Finn, the youngest, recovered with the resilience of youth. His initial sullenness gave way to a grudging respect. He had a knack with animals, and Agnes, noticing his gentle hands with a spooked mare, assigned him to the barn. Silas, the quiet one, was a born tinkerer. He found a broken music box on Agnes's mantelpiece, its delicate gears frozen. Without asking, he took it apart on the hearth one evening, cleaning and mending it with tools from the workshop. When he finally wound it up, a fragile, tinny melody filled the tense silence of the cabin. Agnes stopped her reading, looking over the top of her spectacles. She said nothing, but she didn't tell him to stop. For the first time, a sound not born of necessity had been allowed into her space. Caleb was the watcher. He worked the hardest, splitting cords of wood until his muscles screamed, mending the corral fence with a grim determination. He watched Agnes. He saw how she moved, how she anticipated the needs of the ranch before they became problems. He saw the way she would pause at the window and look out over the valley toward Redemption, her expression hardening. He had seen that look before, on the faces of people who had been judged and found wanting by a world that didn't bother to look closely. One afternoon, while clearing snow from the roof of the barn, he saw a rider approaching. It was the sheriff, a man named Barlow, a preening bantam rooster of a man with a drooping mustache and an oversized badge. Caleb slid down the ladder and stood by the barn door as Barlow dismounted. "Afternoon," Barlow said, his eyes scanning past Caleb as if he were part of the scenery. "Come to see the widow Blackwood." He was looking at the cabin, his gaze proprietary and dismissive. Agnes emerged onto the porch before Caleb could answer, her shotgun cradled casually in her arm. "Sheriff," she said, her tone flat. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "Run out of cats to rescue from trees." Barlow's face tightened. "Just a courtesy call, Agnes. Town's been worried. Haven't seen you in weeks. And now there's talk. Talk of vagrants." He let his gaze drift pointedly to Caleb, then to Finn, who was emerging from the barn. "I have hired hands," Agnes stated, her voice cold as the iron pump handle. "Since when is that the town's business?" "Hired hands," Barlow chuckled, a nasty, insinuating sound. "Funny, they look more like half-starved coyotes to me. A woman like you, alone up here. People might think you're being taken advantage of." The insult was clear. A fat, lonely woman, too simple to know any better. Caleb felt a surge of hot anger. Before he could speak, Agnes took a step forward. "The only one who has ever tried to take advantage of me, Sheriff, is your brother-in-law at the bank. These men work. They earn their keep, which is more than I can say for some folk in your town. Now, if you have official business, state it. If not, my property line is 2 miles back that way." She gestured with her chin down the snow-covered track. Barlow's face went purple. He sputtered for a moment, then climbed back onto his horse. "You mark my words, Agnes. You're making a mistake. The town won't stand for it." He wheeled his horse and galloped away, churning up snow in his wake. The 3 men stood in silence, watching him go. The air crackled with the aftermath of the confrontation. Agnes hadn't just given them shelter, she had defended them. She had claimed them. That evening, the silence in the cabin felt different. It was no longer the silence of shame and awkwardness, but the quiet of a shared trench, the unspoken understanding of a common enemy. As Silas wound the music box, its tiny melody seemed less fragile, more defiant. Caleb looked at Agnes, who was reading by the fire, and for the first time, he didn't see a rich, obese widow. He saw a queen in her fortress, and he was one of her sworn men. The debt he owed her was no longer for a bowl of stew, but for a piece of his dignity she had handed back to him, right in front of the man who had tried to take it. The weeks after Sheriff Barlow's visit passed with the slow, grinding melt of the spring thaw. The dynamic on the mountain had changed. The men were no longer just survivors earning their keep. They were inhabitants, part of the ranch's ecosystem. The crude offer made in a blizzard was a distant, shameful memory, buried under layers of shared work and quiet respect. They were Agnes Blackwood's men now, a fact that was solidifying into a kind of unspoken loyalty that none of them had anticipated. They learned her stories not through words, but through objects. Silas, while repairing a loose floorboard in her bedroom, a task she supervised with hawk-eyed vigilance, found a small, beautifully carved wooden bird. He held it up. Agnes's face softened for a fraction of a second. "My father made that," she said, her voice softer than they had ever heard it. He thought a woman's hands should be for delicate things. She looked at her own hands, calloused and strong from work. He was a dreamer. It was the most she had ever revealed about herself, a tiny keyhole into a locked-up past. Finn, whose youthful energy had returned in full, took it upon himself to break the most stubborn colt in the herd. It was a vicious, wild-eyed creature that had thrown every ranch hand Jedediah had ever hired. Finn spent weeks with the horse, not with force, but with a patience that surprised everyone. He'd sit in the corral for hours, just talking to it, until the animal finally allowed him to touch its neck. One bright, cold morning, he rode it out of the corral, the colt moving with a smooth, easy gait. Agnes stood on the porch, watching, a rare, small smile touching her lips. She didn't praise him with words, but that evening, there was a slice of apple pie next to his dinner plate, a gesture more eloquent than any compliment. Caleb's relationship with her deepened in a different way. He was the one who discussed the ranch with her as an equal. He pointed out a section of fence that would likely be washed out by the spring runoff and suggested a better place to rebuild it. He noticed a sickness in one of the lead steers and knew the right poultice to apply. They would sit on the porch in the evenings, not speaking for long stretches, simply watching the sun set over the jagged peaks, comfortable in a shared silence that would have been unimaginable months before. He began to see the keen intelligence behind her brusque exterior, the profound loneliness she masked with self-sufficiency. He saw not her size, but her strength. The town saw a caricature. He was beginning to see the woman. Their fragile peace was shattered on a trip to Redemption for supplies. Caleb and Finn took the wagon, a list from Agnes in hand. The moment they tethered the horses outside the general store, the atmosphere turned hostile. Men on the boardwalk stopped talking and stared. Women pulled their children closer. Mr. Abernathy, the store owner, served them with curt, clipped words, his eyes constantly darting toward the door as if expecting the sheriff to burst in. The true venom came from a group of men loafing near the saloon. One of them, a lanky drover with a mean-spirited grin, stepped in front of Finn. "Well, look what the fat widow dragged down from the mountain," he sneered. "You boys enjoying the accommodations? Heard she's real, hospitable." Finn's face flushed with rage. "You shut your mouth." "Or what?" The drover taunted, emboldened by his friend's laughter. "You gonna have your sugar mama come fight your battles for you? What'd she pay you with? Biscuits or bed privileges?" Before Finn could launch himself at the man, Caleb's hand clamped down on his shoulder like a vice. "We're not here for this, Finn," Caleb said, his voice a low growl. He looked the drover dead in the eye. "We work for Mrs. Blackwood. She's a decent woman who pays an honest wage. You got a problem with that, your problem's with me." His voice was quiet, but carried a weight that made the drover hesitate. Caleb was no longer the starved creature who had begged on his knees. He was solid, strong, and his eyes held a cold fire. The men backed off, grumbling. But the damage was done. The ride back up the mountain was silent and heavy. The town's poison had followed them home. They knew, with a grim certainty, that Sheriff Barlow's threat had not been idle. Redemption was not going to leave them alone. The feeling of being watched grew in the following days. Caleb would catch glimpses of a rider on a distant ridge, too far to identify, who would disappear when spotted. The unspoken truce was over. They were under siege. The tension settled back into the cabin, tighter than before. Agnes became even more withdrawn, her face set in grim lines. The men felt like a burden, the cause of her trouble. One evening, Caleb found her in the barn, staring at the colt Finn had tamed. "He did good work with this one," she said without turning. "He did," Caleb agreed. "This is what they hate," she said, her voice thick with a bitterness she rarely showed. "That I don't need them. That I can run this place myself. That I have money and I don't simper and ask for their help. A woman like me is supposed to be pitiable, grateful for any crumb of attention. When I'm not, it offends them." She finally turned to him, her eyes fierce in the lantern light. "And now you three. You're happy here. You work hard. You're becoming whole again. They can't stand that either. That something good could happen here, without their permission." It was then that Caleb understood the true stakes. This wasn't just about three drifters finding shelter. It was about a woman's right to live her life on her own terms. It was about defiance. "We can leave, Agnes," he said softly, using her first name for the first time. "We won't bring this trouble on you." She looked at him, a long, searching look. "And where would you go? Back to the blizzard?" Her tone wasn't mocking. It was a simple statement of fact. She shook her head. "No, I took you in. This is my fight." Then she said something that changed everything. "Jedediah, my husband, he bought this land, but he never understood it. He saw it as an investment. You see the soul of it. You all do." Her words hung in the dusty air of the barn. It was an admission of kinship, a declaration that they belonged. The threat from the town was no longer just a threat against her, or against them. It was a threat against their home. And as Caleb stood there, he knew he wouldn't leave. He would stand and fight for this place, and for the formidable, lonely, kind woman who had saved his life. The debt was now a bond, forged in iron and defiance. The confrontation came, as they all knew it would, on a Sunday. The church bells had barely finished their tolling in Redemption when 2 wagons and a handful of riders appeared at the bottom of the long track leading up to the ranch. Sheriff Barlow was in the lead, but he wasn't alone. Beside him rode Mr. Henderson, the bank manager and Barlow's brother-in-law, a man whose smile was as thin and cold as a winter razor. With them were a half-dozen of the town's concerned citizens, the same men who had sneered at Finn and Caleb outside the general store. It was not a posse, it was a lynch mob of public opinion, come to enforce their narrow-minded will. Finn spotted them from the barn loft. "Riders coming," he yelled, his voice tight with alarm. By the time the grim procession reached the homestead, Agnes and the three men were waiting on the porch. She stood in the center, her hands resting on her hips, the shotgun conspicuously absent. She would not meet them with violence, but with something far more formidable, her presence. Caleb stood to her right, Silas and Finn to her left. They were unarmed, holding nothing but their ground. They stood not behind her, but beside her. Barlow reined in his horse, a theatrical display of authority. "Agnes," he began, his tone oozing false concern. "We've come to help you. These men have clearly taken advantage of your good nature. Henderson here has a court order demanding their removal on grounds of vagrancy and trespassing." Henderson held up a piece of paper, waving it like a flag of conquest. "It's for your own good, Agnes. We'll see these gentlemen are escorted from the county, and the bank will be happy to provide you with some proper, vetted help to manage the ranch." Agnes let the silence stretch. She looked from Barlow's smug face to Henderson's greedy one, then at the shuffling, uncomfortable men behind them. "My own good, Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice carrying with startling clarity in the still mountain air. "Your concern is touching, especially since your version of help involves selling off my northern pasture to the railroad for a price you neglect to mention to me." Henderson's face paled. Barlow sputtered, "That's a preposterous accusation." "Is it?" Agnes's gaze was like granite. "I read my own mail, Sheriff, including the letters from the Union Pacific that your brother-in-law was supposed to be handling for me." She then turned her attention to the assembled townsmen. "And you come up here to my home, waving papers and righteousness. You call these men vagrants. Let me tell you about these vagrants." She pointed a commanding finger at Silas. "This man, Silas, spent a week of his own time fixing the music box my father gave me, which your town's so-called expert clockmaker said was beyond repair. It was the only thing I had left of my father that still held a piece of his joy. This vagrant gave that back to me." Silas straightened, a flicker of pride in his quiet eyes. Her finger moved to Finn. "That boy," she said, her voice ringing with passion, "tamed a horse that threw every man in this valley, including my late husband. He did it not with a whip or a spur, but with a kindness your town seems to have forgotten the meaning of. He's brought more life to this ranch in 3 months than I've seen in 10 years. Finn stood taller, his youthful anger replaced by a hard-won dignity. Finally, she looked toward Caleb, and her voice softened, just for a moment. "And this man, Caleb, understands this land. He sees what needs to be done before I do. He works from sunup to sundown, not for a wage, but because he respects the earth he stands on. He has given me his counsel, his strength, and his loyalty. He has treated me with more decency than any man in your town ever has." She took a step forward, her presence so immense it seemed to push the riders back. "You see 3 trespassers. I see honesty. I see skill. I see honor. These men are not vagrants. They are my master foreman, my head stockman, and my chief groundskeeper. They are employees of the Blackwood Ranch. And you, Sheriff, are trespassing on my property and harassing my staff." The men behind Barlow shifted, their certainty beginning to crumble. They had come to rescue a pathetic victim. They had found a queen defending her court. Caleb stepped forward then, standing shoulder to shoulder with Agnes. He looked directly at Barlow. "The lady has spoken," he said, his voice calm and unbreakable. "I suggest you listen." It was the final blow. Barlow, stripped of his moral pretext, was just a bully on a horse. He looked from Agnes's unyielding face to the 3 men standing with her, a united front of defiance. He saw he was beaten. With a curse, he wrenched his horse's reins and galloped back down the track, his posse of concerned citizens trailing behind him like dogs with their tails between their legs, leaving only Henderson, who crumpled the now useless court order in his fist before following. The dust settled. The sound of their retreat faded, leaving behind a profound silence on the mountain. For a long moment, the four of them remained on the porch, a tableau of victory. The air was thick with unspoken things: relief, gratitude, a deep and abiding connection forged in the crucible of that confrontation. Agnes finally let out a long breath she seemed to have been holding for a decade. She turned and looked at Caleb, then at Silas and Finn. A genuine, unguarded smile transformed her face, erasing the hard lines of worry and solitude. "Well," she said, her voice a little shaky but laced with triumph, "I suppose the chief groundskeeper should see about mending that gate latch Henderson nearly broke in his hurry to leave." Finn let out a whoop of pure joy, and even Silas cracked a wide grin. But Caleb's gaze remained on Agnes. In that moment, he saw her completely. Not her wealth, not her size, not the town's cruel caricature, but the magnificent, powerful, and deeply kind woman who had saved them, and whom they, in turn, had just helped to save. He stepped closer, his voice low and for her alone. "We're in your debt, Agnes." She met his gaze, her eyes shining. "No, Caleb," she corrected him gently. "We're home." She turned and went inside the cabin, leaving the door open behind her. The smell of baking bread, warm and life-affirming, drifted out. One by one, her men followed her in, leaving the judgment of the world down in the valley below. They were four solitary people who, against all odds, had found their place. The desperate, shameful offer made in a blizzard had been answered, not with scorn or acceptance, but with the creation of a family, built on a foundation of respect stronger than any stone. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.